Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for June 24th, 2021. Well, there was a confrontation in the Black Sea yesterday, which was provoked by the British. And this just makes absolutely evident that there's a thin line between the potential for peace based on dialogue and the danger of war based on mistake, accident, or purposeful operation. The event yesterday was a provocation in which a British Royal Navy destroyer, the HMS Defender, passed very close to Crimea. It violated the maritime boundary in Crimea, and the ship ignored repeated warnings. At a certain point, there were shots fired across the bow, warning shots, and it was even reported that there were some bombs dropped in its path to cause it to turn back. Interestingly, the British Ministry of Defense denied that there was anything that happened. They said there was no incident. However, a spokesman for Boris Johnson implied that there probably was an incident by saying the UK does not recognize Russian claims to Crimea. The Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba attacked Russia for aggressive and provocative actions in the Black Sea. And you may remember during the height of the Ukraine crisis, the US was going to send several naval vessels into the Black Sea, but thought twice about it and turned them back. Well, that doesn't stop the British. They're continuing to carry out provocations. Now, this is precisely the kind of event that Helge Zepp-LaRouche has been warning about, that could trigger a war. Either pilots in flight paths crossing over each other's so-called territory, battleships that cross into other nations' claimed waters. Any number of these kinds of incidents could lead to shooting, which could lead to mobilization of forces and possibly even nuclear strikes. Now, this is what Putin was talking about at the Russian International Security event yesterday, where he said, quote, "Geopolitical processes are becoming increasingly turbulent despite isolated positive signals. The erosion of international law continues as well," he said. He expressed once again concern over the NATO buildup of military and equipment in Eastern Europe, close to the borders of Russia. Now, it's important that the strategic stability talks, which were agreed upon at the Geneva Convention or Geneva Summit, are coming up soon, probably in July. But this kind of provocation shows why it's urgent that these talks take place as soon as possible, and the talks, rather than actions, define the basis of relations. Former British Ambassador Craig Murray, who's known for his defense of Julian Assange, pointed out the obvious when he was asked about his view of this. He said there's no cause for British warships to be cruising in the Black Sea. There's no British coast to defend. There are no British interests to defend. He said, quote, "The UK needs to lose its imperial ambitions. Sending gunboats to the Crimea is evidence of lunacy," unquote. Let me point out another sign of lunacy. There are reports coming out on the role that the FBI played in the confrontation which occurred at the Capitol on January 6th. The FBI, through surveillance, through planting operatives in the various groups involved, had evidence that there could be violence take place on the day when the Congress met to certify the election. But for some reason, they did not raise the alarm to include a deployment of more forces. And so the security forces at the Capitol were inadequate for what actually occurred. Now, this has been blamed, of course, on Trump as the provocateur. But the FBI has a history of deploying provocateurs into actions which justify further FBI intervention. Just a few examples. The FBI infiltrated the Communist Party of the United States. They infiltrated civil rights organizations, including more violent ones. They have a history of launching plots among so-called jihadists, including the famous bomb plot in New York, where a mentally unstable Muslim man was egged on by the FBI, who showed him where to get explosives, how to pack the explosives, and so on. There's ample history of the FBI infiltrating the Ku Klux Klan. The famous event was in the late 70s in Greensboro, where Maoists and the KKK had a shootout in Greensboro. And on both sides, it turned out in the court, in the documents released, both sides had FBI infiltrators provoking the confrontation. Now, I'm bringing this up because there are now reports of at least 20 unindicted co-conspirators who were involved on January 6th. How many of them were FBI operatives who had infiltrated groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers? How many were working with the FBI? How many of them were instigating the violence? How many of them are inside the radical groups involved in Black Lives Matter and Antifa? What about the failed plot that the FBI supposedly uncovered against Michigan Governor Whitmer? It turns out of the 14 who were involved in this, 5 were either FBI undercover agents or informants. This is the kind of unlawfulness which is provoking the tension that could lead to violent confrontations, as it already did on January 6th. So on the one side, you have geopolitical deployments against Russia, against China, lies, false flags, things of this sort which put us on a course toward war. And then you have the so-called security state, which is organized under the broad rubric of the war on terror, which includes a surveillance state, which includes deployment of informants and provocateurs into various organizations to egg on and even cause these events to occur. So this brings us to an important question. On the one hand, we need to have an encouragement of a real process of dialogue between the United States, Russia, China. And at the Valdai Club meeting recently, there was a call from one of the top officials there to bring India in, which means that there's now open support for what Lyndon LaRouche called for in 2008, 2009, the idea of a 4-power agreement of Russia, China, India, and the United States to take up questions of international security, economic policy, and so on. Now, that's the way you outflank the security state. The security state is being deployed to defend the idea of no national sovereignty, that all nations must submit to an arbitrary rules-based order, which has been created to defend the interests of the City of London and Wall Street. So if you have an alliance of those 4 states that can mobilize against the attempt to set up a dictatorship of central banks, the role of the International Monetary Fund, the Bank for International Settlements, instead to have nations working together for their common interests as sovereign nation states, that's the way to resolve this problem. As for the security state, when are we going to get the documents publicly released from Russiagate, from the Durham investigation? When will we get to see the role that the British GCHQ and MI6 played in provoking the lies of Russiagate, which put a handcuff on the Trump administration in its attempt to establish peaceful cooperation agreements with Russia? So on this verge of war, of civil disobedience, of chaos, of insurrection, so-called, what we find is there's one grouping which has a vested interest in promoting this, the same grouping that puts out the lies in the media and is censoring on social media. This must be exposed and must be defeated. This will be one of the topics at the Schiller Institute conference this weekend, the 26th and 27th of June, beginning at 9 a.m. on Saturday. You can register for it at theschillerinstitute.com. We need you to be part of this mobilization, which is the same mobilization as shutting down the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. Thanks for joining me today. Tomorrow is Friday. I'll be taking your questions. You can send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com. See you then.